Hi everyone, I hope you're having a great day. I'm very excited today for I'm being joined by Alex Krainer, a market analyst, an author, and also a former hedge fund manager. Hi Alex, it's great to finally meet you. I've been looking forward to this.
Thank you for having me, Glenn. It's an honor to join you, and greetings to all your viewers and listeners.
One of the key reasons I want to talk to you is that the world is changing very fast, and yet there's often this common thinking that everything is more or less defined by geopolitics as opposed to geoeconomics. And we see that the great power rivalry today is to a large extent defined by the economics, not only the military power. And I really wanted to, pick your brain about the future of the political West as an entity because we see that the world always changes, and at times it, of course, changes quite fast and dramatically. Yet there always seems to be this assumption uh, that the conditions of the present time somehow is permanent, as if things won't change. And I guess the unity of the political West formed again under very unique conditions after the Second World War. It's not necessarily a stable construct. There's very different interests. The unity was based on a very unique international distribution of power, and I even published a book back in 2021. It was called Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, Geoeconomic Regions in a Multipolar World. And the whole topic was that Europe would have a very hard time adjusting to multipolarity, and again, the collective hegemony of the West wouldn't function anymore under such conditions. So at the time, of course, it was difficult to make the argument that huge shifts were going to come and might break the US from Russia and fragment Europe itself. But it seems, we're moving in this direction now. So I was wondering how, from your economic background and also this, geostrategic analysis, what do you see happening with the West at the moment? Can you explain the fragmentation we're seeing?
Well, okay, so I would take that from two sides. One would be, let's say, looking at the unraveling of the post-World War II system, which we were led to believe is something next to permanent. It led to a unipolar moment when we were encouraged to think that that was the end of history as we know it, because now everything is so perfect. It would stay that way forever. But I think that there was something incoherent to that order. So it was inherently unstable, and I think it's now crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. In At the end of World War II, the world was the alliance that prevailed was the alliance of Soviet Union, Western nations, and the United States. But then, for reasons that are difficult to fathom, uh, the British uh, kind of put a wedge in that alliance. But as far as I know, the first explicit expression of this was Winston Churchill's Fulton speech in 1946, delivered in the presence of President Harry Truman, in which he said explicitly that the Soviet Union was the enemy of the West, the same Soviet Union that just months before that had finally defeated Nazi Germany. And then 3 years later, we had the formation of NATO alliance, and then we had a slow, gradual escalation of the Cold War until the Soviet Union was no more. And so we had two blocks form, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, the democratic capitalist bloc and the autocratic communist bloc. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union imploded, as did most of the other socialist countries of the Warsaw Pact. And now the even the ideological dimension of this Cold War division was no longer there. But nevertheless, NATO alliance didn't disband and declare victory. They continued moving in the direction of Russia. And from there came an escalation towards first Cold War 2.0, and then now we have actually a hot war by proxy, which could escalate to World War III or IV, or whatever the number should be, rightfully. And so that's that. I think that the contradiction was that there was this artificial division that was almost imposed, that the West has to be opposed to Russia. And then even after the ideological reasons for that division vanished, the division remained. That is the opposition, the antagonism between East and West remains. And so, for me, I grew up in one of the countries that suffered that fate, which was a former Yugoslavia. It was also a socialist country under one-party communist rule. And when in the early 90s, this whole socialist world was falling apart, we also had wars of succession, and the country fell apart. And so ever since then, I couldn't kind of grasp why all this happened and how it happened and what are the ultimate incentives that are actually like the moving principles behind all this. And it pretty much took me my lifetime to work it out. And my crosshairs fell on the banking system, on the financial system, and I think its headquarters remain the City of London, with greater and lesser satellites like Paris, Wall Street, Frankfurt, Rome, Tokyo, etc. And so I try to explain to myself what causes this aggressive behavior. What is it that inclines the West, supposedly all liberal democracies, to be always engaged in wars? Not all of them, of course, perhaps not Denmark so much, or Austria, but particularly the Anglo-American axis. Why are they always at war? The empirical fact is that between 1946 and today, the United States had initiated more than 80% of all international military conflicts in the world. So that's after World War II. American people always vote against wars. They always vote in favor of candidates who promise them peace, no more nation building, and on and on and on, but they always get more war. So what is the reason? And I think the reason is, to put it in one word, collateral. So it falls back on our financial systems that we have in most countries in the world today, where money is put into circulation as debt almost exclusively. So no debt, no money. And in order for the banking institutions to issue debt, they need collateral, right? So you always have to post collateral on the basis of which a bank can issue credit. That's the only way that I think something like 97% of all money in circulation ever enters into circulation. And then we have the next problem is that only the principal of that loan comes into circulation, but it has to be repaid with interest, right? So let's say if you buy a house, if you get a typical loan, I don't know, you borrow 100,000 euros or €500,000, whichever it be, over the lifetime of that loan, you will need to pay about twice the amount, right? So if you borrowed 500,000, you're going to have to pay back a whole million. Except the other 500,000 never went into circulation. You had to earn it. And how can you possibly earn it? The only way is for that money to even exist is because other people raise credit, and so that money gets into circulation, and you have to earn that money through transactions to be able to pay off your own loan. So the system actually is a Ponzi scheme, in the sense that it has to always grow to remain stable. So it needs to always draw more and more collateral into the system in order to issue more and more loans in order for all the existing loans to be even payable. But what happens in any economic system, any closed economic system, is that at some point you're going to saturate it with debt. There's no other collateral anymore in the system. You know, I could raise this much debt, but I couldn't raise $1 billion in debt, right? Because no bank would give me that credit. And so that creates then the incentive to seek out collateral abroad. And so the system of governance that has kind of coalesced around this monetary system creates very strong incentives to colonize, to go to other countries, to subjugate them and take their resource wealth as collateral. What that means is that, you end up either having to control the political process in the country, the presidents, prime ministers, the militaries, the secret police, and all that, or you have to subjugate them militarily, you have to conquer them, right? And then your banking institutions can go there and say, like, oh, yeah, Saudi Arabia has all this oil. Well, we're going to send our corporations to develop those resources. And that way, it's going to be our banks who are going to be financing that development, which means effectively that resources which are abroad, which are in Saudi Arabia or in South America or in Russia or in Kazakhstan, wherever, they become the collateral on the basis of which our own domestic banks issue credit to their own clients. And so the part of the equation that we see, because it's visible, is we see these large global corporations like BP and Shell and Exxon and KBR and Halliburton and hundreds of these foreign corporations go abroad and they develop foreign resources. But the part that we don't see is that actually most of the wealth that's thereby extracted from these effectively colonies actually goes to the banking centers in the West, Paris, London, Wall Street, etc. And so this is where the whole system of incentives for our system of governance originates. It has been this way in the West. It has defined the Western civilization, and it goes back, depending on how you wish to define it, 500 or 600 years, or you could even draw back to all the way to Greek antiquity. The same principle turned Greece into an empire, and then Greek bankers migrated to Rome, and that system turned Rome into an empire. And then it reemerged again in Venice in the Middle Ages, and then it gave rise to the Lombard banking system. And then the Venetian bankers migrated to Amsterdam and gave rise to the Dutch Empire. And then from there, they migrated to London, where it gave rise to the British Empire, which, unlike what they teach us in school today, is still very much alive, and it still is kicking. And I think that today that this is becoming increasingly apparent because even in today's historical episode around Ukraine, we see that the United States has withdrawn and London has stepped right into the role of backing up Ukraine. Before I finish. So today's empire is let's say some form of an undead reincarnation of the British Empire, and British Empire's geopolitical imperative has been to maintain hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. And as we know from the theses that were formulated by Halford Mackinder already more than a century ago. The way they envisage to do this is to prevent a land-based empire from emerging, which they assumed would be Russia in what Mackinder describes as a pivot area in his 1904 paper called The Geographical Pivot of the World. And then later he reformulated it as the heartland theory. And so, from there we get the who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland, who controls the heartland controls the world island, which is Eurasian landmass, and who controls the world island controls the world. So working back is control of Eastern Europe has been pivotal to the British Empire ever since the early 1900s and earlier still. And so in the run-up to World War I, the idea was to build up Germany as the regional hegemon to control Central and Eastern Europe, and then thereby to control the heartland and the world island. And that strategy failed. And now plan B is to use Ukraine as the regional hegemon to control Eastern Europe and to use it to break up Russia and then to control the heartland and the world island. And now we are experiencing now the failure of this second attempt, but I expect that they will not give up so easily. So they will, when they are finished fighting to the last Ukrainian, they will attempt to fight to the last Romanian and Bulgarian and Czech and Hungarian and Polish and Estonian and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's interesting. This people don't realize how central this Mackinder's heartland theory has actually been. If you go through the strategic documents from the United States throughout the Cold War, it keeps popping up all the time. These references to the Eurasian heartland, making sure no powerful hegemonic or group of states begin to cooperate that can challenge, well, first the British, but then of course the United States. Even after the Cold War, when the Wolfowitz Doctrine came up, they in this document in beginning of 1992, when they called for this hegemonic, well, unipolar world, like how can this be sustained? And they even then there refer to the heartland theory. That is, we have to make sure nothing appears in the heartland. This has to become NATO's area, and so it is. It's interesting because this geographical pivot of history. This is an idea which has really uh, persevered for so long. But as we see now, historically for the British, it meant keep the Germans and the Russians apart because these two powerhouses in Europe, they would together form this dominant central power. And indeed, this is kind of the joke as well that the British joined the EU, so they would make sure that it would never be too functional, that they could drive a wedge here and there. But it doesn't seem like we adjusted quite to what's happening now, because by pushing Russia into Asia, again during the first Crimean War in 1850s, it meant pushing Europe into Asia meant sorry pushing Russia into Asia meant to make it economically backwards and pointless. But these days, pushing Russia into Asia means right into the hands of China, which is it's not the second Germany. It's a Germany on all the steroids in the world. This is a massive economy. Uh, but this is what I mean. Now that the world is shifting, you're seeing the Russians with the Chinese, the European Union. How are they gonna? How can they compete now anymore? Because the key technologies, the main transportation corridors, the banks, the currency, everything which was almost a complete monopoly of the collective West is now being lost. So, how do you how do you think the Europeans versus the Americans going to react to this new world which is taking shape?
Well, I think we're stuck unless and until the leadership in key European powers is has changed radically. I mean, by that I mean probably in Germany you're going to have a government dominated by AfD, who have already said that they would withdraw from NATO and from the European Union, and similar governments will have to take power in other nations, particularly France. Going back, what I wanted to say, going back to Macinder's theory, you're absolutely right. This is still very much with us, and it really has determined geopolitics as we are observing it today. Um, in 1930s, the British had their geopolitical concept was the three block world. And their three block world concept kind of their policy towards Germany derived from that. They had a 7-point policy that they communicated to Hitler's government, and also at some point since from 1937 onwards, they also communicated to the German government this three block concept where basically the world would be divided into three basic zones: the Euro-Atlantic zone, Britain um, dominating it in cooperation with the United States, in partnership with the United States, dominating Europe in alliance with Germany, and then dominating East Asia with in alliance with Japan. And this same concept then became it practically got transplanted into American foreign policy. And the three block concept is why the Trilateral Commission is called trilateral. That was founded by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. And then the idea of dominating the Mackinder idea of dominating the Eurasian landmass also goes through the same disciples, Kissinger and Brzezinski. And so it was the last time I heard it explicitly formulated in a foreign policy discussion was when Undersecretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs under Trump, his name was Wes Mitchell. He succeeded Victoria Nuland in that position. Gave a briefing to U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he said explicitly that the number one priority of the administration's foreign policy is to maintain U.S. dominance over the Eurasian continent, and that they are cooperating very closely with our ally, the United Kingdom. So that's on record from 2019. So this was during the last year of Donald Trump's first administration. I do think that this is changing now. I do think that the Trump administration has taken a radically different turn, including in foreign policy. And I think that the failure in Ukraine is part of the reason for it. Not necessarily that the failure has dissuaded them, but I think that the failure in Ukraine has revealed what the covert strategy has been all along. You know, for a long time, many people thought it was about defending the post-World War II order, freedom and democracy, sovereignty, and inviolability of borders, and so on and so forth. Well, State Secretary Rubio, when he appeared before Congress in his confirmation hearings, explicitly said that the post-World War II order is more than obsolete and that it is now being used as a weapon against us, that is, against the United States. I think that this statement should have caused a lot more uproar because I think it's absolutely spectacular. Marco Rubio didn't think that up himself. This is the position of the Trump administration. And so this is a radical departure from the post-World War II order as we knew it. And so we are now in completely uncharted territories, and the developments we can look forward to from here on forward are things that are going to be very, very different from the world that we knew until now.
How do you read in Marco Rubio's comment though that the post-World War II order is being used against the United States because this was meant to build the base, be the foundation of its dominance.
Well, you know, the dominance came at a very, very steep price. So the United States, well, you know, as a uh, for everybody who's old enough to remember the film Mad Max 3, there was this a Master Blaster combo, right? It was a big, dumb, muscular giant who had a little decrepit dwarf riding on his back and directing him where to smash up things. And so this to me is the perfect metaphor for the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. The United States has been doing all the heavy lifting and the fighting and the financing of the empire, maintaining the military bases around the world at a huge cost to the American people, to the taxpayer. It has largely depleted American prosperity. It has weakened it militarily. It has weakened it socially. It has even weakened it politically and diplomatically around the world. So, you know, there is a certain, let's call it, corporate and banking elite who has benefited hugely from this, but it hasn't been the country as a whole. Uh, the country has a massive debt overhang that it's going to have a very hard time resolving as a result of all this, and the cost of maintaining the empire keeps going up and up and up. But it's only a very narrow segment of the society that's benefiting from that. And most of the beneficiaries are actually not in the United States, even they are in Europe and in the United Kingdom. Uh, so we have, you know, the obvious example is the cost of maintaining the empire, the 800 or 900 military bases everywhere around the world, who are there not to ensure freedom and democracy in those countries, but to make sure that the contracts for the extraction of natural wealth from those countries is awarded to Western corporations or to other clients of the Western banking institutions or the IMF or the World Bank or other private banking institutions. And then you have also the fact we see that very clearly now with the example of Ukraine, where it's very obvious that main beneficiaries of Ukrainian war are European powers and the British power and Great Britain, who are now very desperate to keep the United States engaged because without the United States, uh, as Boris Johnson recently said from an interview in Kiev, not a penny of all that of all those profits from Ukraine are going to be able to flow westwards. Well, that means that the United States has to continue funding Ukraine and continue providing military support. What does it mean to guarantee security of Ukraine? It means that you might end up in a war with Russia if Russia attacks Western interests in Ukraine. So the benefit to the United States is very dubious. They're being dangled this rare earth minerals deal, which supposedly is worth $500 billion. That figure came from Volodymyr Zelensky. But it's very dubious whether these minerals even exist in the part of Ukraine that's still controlled by Kiev. On the other hand, the downside is that the United States might end up in a nuclear war against Russia. So there again, we have a perfect example of the benefits to the United States from being the global policeman versus the risks and the cost that it's incurring in this process. And so now you have a Trump administration in the White House who's thinking, okay, so Ukraine has, let's say, an estimated $12 trillion worth of resources. Already the bulk of that is controlled by the Russian side. The British and the Europeans are desperate to retain control over what's left of Ukraine, but they need us to provide security guarantees. On the other hand, Russia has an estimated 75 to 90 trillion dollars in resource wealth that they are offering to us to develop jointly. and securities for free because the Russians are already providing it, and they do have an escalatory dominance in the region. So there's no risk of slip sliding into a World War III scenario or a nuclear confrontation. Uh, there's a much larger um, wealth basis to develop there together, and we don't need to fund Ukraine's government anymore. The cost benefit analysis of those two, between those two choices, is so obvious that I think it's clear that Trump administration is going to abandon the Europeans and the Ukraine and the British to their own devices, and that they will probably uh, um, ally themselves with Russia. And that shouldn't seem so strange. As you said, uh, political arrangements are not forever, they change. And, even though we've been brainwashed for decades, Russia bad, Putin evil, and so forth, um, the United States had a very close friendship and an alliance with Russia throughout most of the 19th century. In fact, if it wasn't for Russia, the United States probably wouldn't exist today. It was Russian intervention during the Civil War in the United States in 1863 that helped Lincoln preserve the Union, which was being broken apart by, again, Paris and London.
Yeah, no, it's I find it fascinating how people bought into this to this narrative. Again, all American security strategies after the Cold War all focused around how to perpetuate hegemony so that US would remain dominant. And yet, and of course, whenever you get any insights into the leaks from CIA and all, through WikiLeaks, it's always very explicit what they're doing behind the scene, which is sell hegemony as a human rights project and democracy. But at the same time, everyone, in Germany, I've seen the ministers talk there. Oh, we need this lithium from Ukraine if we're going to have this, to feed our new technologies and this green New Deal. You see in the United States, they keep talking about all the, trillions of dollars of Ukrainian natural resources. And then, of course, when you open the paper, yeah, freedom, democracy, as if this is what the empire is dedicated to make sure that Ukrainians are doing well. I mean, it's really absurd, but still they're able to sell this argument over and over again. But I wanted to ask about NATO because I saw you predicted that you expected at least that NATO would fall apart and collapse. But this was a while ago, and at that time, I guess many people would, maybe, yeah, be a bit skeptical of such arguments. But suddenly now, over the past few days, with Elon Musk taking to Twitter, why are we still in NATO? Blah blah blah. It does beg the question. Well, why do you think NATO? Well, if not standing on its last leg, it has some challenges ahead. It might not fall apart, but there's a lot of pressure on it now.
Okay, so Glenn, if you'll allow me, before I answer that question, I want to go back for a second to the question of resources because
Sorry,
I
yeah,
want
go.
to make a very, very important distinction between, we are we are always being encouraged to think that we have to be in some part of the world present or dominant because we need the lithium, because we need the oil, because we need this or that. And that's again a false narrative that somehow percolates into the discussions, but it is false because I grew up in Croatia. I lived in Switzerland part of my life. You know, for as long as I remember, anytime you went to the gas station, you could buy gasoline, you could buy diesel. In shops, you could buy chocolate and coffee and all kinds of things that we didn't have. But nevertheless, we had them, right? Then, I mean, we didn't produce that, we didn't grow it, but we had them nonetheless. So how did we get them? We got them by trade. So anything you want to have, lithium, oil, gas, iron, rare earths. You can acquire anything you want by trade. You export what you have, you acquire what you need. That's a simple thing, and most countries function that way. Even RFK Jr., I think, has fallen into this trap because he was explaining why the United States had to continue to support Israel because we need to maintain our hegemony over that region because of oil and gas resources that we need. Well, you can always buy them. The only segment of our society that needs to control that, again, is the banking segment because it does them no good to just acquire that resource. The only way they profit from that resource is if they make the loans with which those resources are developed and traded. Anyway, so it always, Germany doesn't need to be anywhere for lithium. They can just buy it. Croatia doesn't need to be anywhere to have coffee and chocolate and gasoline on there. We just buy it. So I just wanted to make sure that that argument doesn't justify anybody's hegemony anywhere else. It's not that. It's the banking cartels that need those resources as their collateral because then they obtain this massive conveyor belt of wealth that's flowing from everywhere else in the world to their banking centers, even though they don't develop it, they don't fight wars, they don't keep military bases there, they don't trade, they don't refine, they don't ship, they don't do anything. Nevertheless, the bulk of that wealth accrues to them. Okay, so back to NATO. Already the Ukraine war has started to erode the foundations of NATO because it started to become clear to people that it's not a defensive alliance, that it's actually an aggressive alliance. NATO has been present in Ukraine since 1991. It has formalized their presence in 1997 with the agreement, I think it was called Agreement on Distinctive Partnership. It was signed in Madrid in 1997. And then it's been building up ever since. And it's very clear that NATO has been one of the key military backers of Ukraine, and not in a defensive way, because many people today understand that Russia's war in Ukraine was not unprovoked, that it was very much provoked, and that NATO had a role in it. Of course, there was the Libya experience, there was the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1991. So I think that the disaffection with NATO already existed there, but I think Ukraine has exasperated it very much. It has brought us to the point where many countries now have already made it explicit that if Article 5 was invoked to join forces and go to war against Russia, many countries would say, no, this is not what we signed up for, and we will not do this. Hungary is one of them, Slovakia is one of them, Croatia is one of them. And I think that there might be more countries as the democratic process in Europe has its effect. I think if it wasn't for the interference in Romania's elections, that Romania would be one of those countries. Two of the largest militaries in NATO, United States and Turkey, are not even on friendly terms anymore, and they're both looking to withdraw from NATO, withdraw their support. So essentially what you have is Great Britain and France, Germany, and then a number of minor European powers who, if you put them all together, would struggle to assemble a 50,000 men army. And we have it on record that the German military believes that they have enough ammunition for about 2 days for an intense fight against Russia. NATO altogether, optimistically, has maybe 2 months worth. They have no Uh, they have no surge capacity in their ammunitions procurement and production. And so they are a very, very weak alliance that has left the individual countries vulnerable. And I think as such, it no longer justifies the budget that the countries have to pay to be members of NATO. And then came Trump administration who said, well, you're going to have to increase your contributions to NATO to 5% of your GDP. If Germany paid 5% of her GDP into the NATO, that would be half of the federal government's budget. This is impossible. And obviously Trump administration, they appreciate this. So what they have done is they have set an impossible condition to even be in the NATO. And I think that they have simply given themselves a pretext and a reason to withdraw. And I think it's only a matter of time before they do. And at that point, the whole purpose of NATO just simply ceases to be.
Yeah, no, I find it interesting what you said about this, the logic behind it, because in Europe everyone seems to be so perplexed, and everything is colored in, good guy versus bad guy. Well, why is America, is it Trump is authoritarian, he prefers authoritarians over democracies. This is kind of the only thinking we have, who's the good guy or the bad guy. But it does make sense because initially for the US to partner with Europe, it made a lot of sense in the early 90s, I would guess, because then there was an opportunity to pillage Russia as well. And we did see that with this disaster privatization. You had the rise of all of these oligarchs in Russia, and all of them suddenly started to reside in London and in the United States, and effectively beginning to run Russia because they controlled not just the markets, the economy, the natural resources, but then also controlling the media and gaining more and more political influence. And they did this from London and the US, and it risked making Russia effectively into a colony. And this was when Putin started to nationalize a lot of these things and going after the oligarchs who tried to interfere into the politics. So, but now that so we kind of try to fight them off for a while. The Russians try to reverse some of this again, dreaming of the 1990s again. But now it makes sense what Trump is doing if we get out of this binary democracy versus authoritarian. Because if the US can trade now with Russia, really develop a lot of their natural resources. Now, this is a lot of money. And also, this allows America to cut its cost in Europe. And America has exhausted itself. I mean, it's $36.5 trillion in the hole. And at the same time, prevent Russia from drifting too close to China, creating alternative or competing rival centers of power. Also, it's not clear to me what the Europeans are suggesting as an alternative, which appears to be let's go to war with Russia, which is an absurd proposition. So, but what you mentioned the weakness of Europe if the Americans leave, because if America leaves Ukraine, it looks as if they then can also pull out of Europe, which Hegseth and others have indicated this is what they want to do. But what can Europe do now? Do they have any options? And if there are no other options, are we going to war? Are we going to accept a very, I guess, reduced position in the world? What do you see in our future?
I think that the ruling establishments in Europe will double down on the same strategy that they've been pursuing for many years now. Going back to being, independent, neutral nations minding their own business, that's unlikely to happen. And I think that the danger is that this process of militarization and Nazification of Europe is going to ramp up. And I think that we can already see this because even though, so I'll step back a second. This is my conviction is that this is a form of a social engineering process, technology, which has been implemented in Germany during the 1930s, which has been implemented in Ukraine between 2014 and now. And the process begins with immiserating the nations, destroying their economies. This is what we saw in Germany from the 1920s onwards. And this is what we saw in Ukraine already practically since its independence. As I mentioned, NATO has been present in Ukraine since 1991. George Soros set up his foundations there around the same time. And then various Ukrainian governments have been advised by Western advisors, including the IMF and the World Bank, and so forth, in how to develop their economy. As a result, Ukraine's economy between 1991 and 2014 has been the world's worst performing economy, dead last, right? It was the only one of only 5 countries in the world whose GDP declined over those 24 years. So from 1991 until 2022, 2014. Interestingly, on the list of 5 nations with negative GDP growth were also Moldova and Georgia. So Ukraine's economy shrank by 35% over those 24 years, Georgia 15%, and I think Moldova, if I remember correctly, about 9%. All 3 of those countries were designated as nations to use as beachheads against Russia. So I think that step one in militarization and Nazification of any nation is to destroy the economy. And so what you get from there is you get a very high youth unemployment rate. You have a lot of men who have no jobs, no prospects, no future, no way to realize their aspirations in life, get married, have a home, raise families. And so what you do then is you go in with these, let's say, far-right ideologies. You start blaming the situation on the designated enemy. So in Germany it was the communists, the Soviets. In Ukraine it was the Jewish Muscovite mafia. That was the designated enemy. The enemy was Moscow. And then you start funding these, C-14, Azov Battalion, Aidar Battalion, right sector, and so forth. And you start giving them money, and you start swelling their ranks. And so now you particularly recruit people into these organizations from football hooligan clubs. So you'll find in a lot of places in Europe, strangely, football fan clubs are strangely well funded. And so that begins the formation of these Azov battalions and these kinds of unit then whose purpose is not to go and fight the enemy. Their purpose is to terrorize the local population, and then at some point to forcibly conscript people off the streets to go and fight the enemy. The episode in Germany during the 1930s was with the brown shirt movement, which I think in 1930 or 1931 numbered around 200 people. The German population didn't take them seriously. They found them a little bit ridiculous. But by the time Hitler came to power in 1933, their ranks were 2 million. Well, now it's not so funny anymore. And so if you look around Europe, we see that right now we're in the process of destroying our economies. There's this deindustrialization with the exception of defense sector. The standard of living are declining, youth unemployment is rising, and you will also find that in practically every country, Sweden, Finland, Hungary, Germany, France, Spain, Croatia, practically every country you look at, Poland, you have these neo-Nazi organizations that are holding tiki torch marches and parades. Strangely, they all have nice uniforms. They have nice banners and placards, and their numbers are increasing. And at the same time, we see that the European leadership is not only talking about conscription and funding a rearmament industry, we see that hundreds of billions of dollars are already flowing into, quote unquote, defense industries. So it seems to me that the whole process of militarization of the continent and Nazification is already unfolding. Maybe it's in its early stages, so it's not quite obvious yet. But I think that if we are not alert, if we're not vigilant, I think that a couple of years down the road, it took about 7, 8 years in Germany. It took about 7, 8 years in Ukraine. I think that in another couple of years in Europe, we might have similar type thugs that we now see in social media abducting men from the streets of Ukraine. We might have similar types of people doing the same on the streets of European cities. And then it might be our children who are going to be disappearing to the fronts and then reappearing under their nation's flag as, fallen heroes. So I think in Europe, we have to be very careful. We have to be very vigilant. We have to not allow ourselves to be silenced and cowed into submission because our children's future actually depends on this.
There's what you're referring to, what happened in Germany is interesting because Dubois he wrote about this in this article back in 1941, in which he pointed out that what had happened in Germany, the fascist political economy, that it actually started to develop before the fascists came to power, that it had its separate logic because after the First World War, they saw this destruction of the middle class, that is, all the incomes, property, value, savings, everything had been destroyed. And he argued this created, in his words, a revolution in the minds of men in Germany because it changed the whole relationship between the people, corporation, and the state. That is, the people were so impoverished, and then, of course, you had the fascist political economy of the corporate and the state going hand in hand. And of course, then subduing the individual has very little to do. He can't stand up because he can't ally with corporation against the state, not with the state against the corporations. And instead, you saw then, this use of a very extreme hatred of the other, our opponents, this militarism, a lot of these very ugly things, which then created this necessary ideology and the organic, belief in the nation as something they should all serve under and die for. It was interesting as he effectively said that, this is an American scholar, but it's black though, so he wasn't in favor of any of this. He just said that this is the economic model which has strong incentives to follow, and he suggested that eventually we're all gonna go down this direction. I guess a brief question before we run out of time. Do you know Trump? He has this new economic thinking. He wants to reverse America's decline because it is, again, as you mentioned before, empire is costly. It's in money as well as in reputation. That is, legitimacy is gone for it, but also and the resources have been sent from the core to the periphery. Everything within is falling apart. The infrastructure, obviously, awful. Economic inequalities, stagnant salaries. With this, you get social instability, political instability, polarization. So all the problems are already here. But now he has these ideas, because at the face of it, a lot of it seems a bit superficial. Like I'm personally a big fan of the American system. So the industrial policies of the 19th century. So I can appreciate the tariffs in terms of, giving your infant industry some time to develop competitiveness against the mature. But it doesn't seem like he has that many other tools in his with him besides the tariffs, or are you seeing something different? Of course, if he's shifting away from Europe as a leech, almost to quote Rubio, and shifting towards a partnership with a wealthier state, of course, this could change. But do you see any optimism behind his economic program?
I think that the economic crisis in the United States is exactly the Achilles heel of his administration. And so I think that I don't take the overt declarations as I don't give them too much importance because I think that partly they serve the purpose of setting the negotiating position, vis-a-vis Europe, Mexico, Canada, China, and so forth. Because tariffs in and of themselves, unless you very carefully prepared the terrain for them, all you're going to do is you're going to import inflation. If you raise the prices of European cars, the domestic manufacturers are immediately going to, and inflation already is a problem, and it's reemerging in the American economy and in Europe. And then by just imposing tariffs, you would exacerbate that. But the ultimate driver of inflation, of monetary inflation is the impossible debt overhang that the United States shares with other European nations. And the way to deal with debt is that you have essentially three ways about it, four maybe. One is default. You say these debts are unpayable. We're not paying it. Too bad. The treasuries you own are worth nothing. But this is politically very difficult to do, and that's not going to happen. One method of default is through inflation. You just inflate the debt away. So that's a possibility that is, let's say, politically easier, and it gives the administration time and maneuvering space in which to do it. But another method is to increase the wealth and productivity of your own economic system. And so, in situation where you don't have very much, like your system is saturated, let's say, with debt, you cannot bring new collateral other than by going to conquer it somewhere else. From that point of view, Trump's declared objective of possibly bringing Canada into the United States and also Greenland could actually serve as that, increasing the wealth of the American economic system, and thereby, let's say, reducing the risk from that debt overhang. But so I think that all of these ideas give Trump administration maneuvering space that they can use. They can use tariffs initially um, as a negotiating tool, as a bargaining chip with China, Europe, Mexico, and so forth. And then as they bring in car industry from Mexico, chip makers from Taiwan, and so forth, then they can start to create tariff protections for them. And then by let's say making major deals for resource development with Russia, bringing Canada into the United States, bringing Greenland into the United States. All this can increase the value, the resource wealth of the American economy. And then we still didn't get to the monetary part where, I think that everybody understands the dollar is doomed, that it's only a matter of time. And so managing a transition to some kind of a new currency system will also maybe that won't be necessary in the 4 years under Trump, but it's only a matter of time. All fiat currencies based on fractional reserve banking ultimately lose purchasing power progressively, and it goes towards zero. And I think that all the economies of the West now are at risk of stagflation and possibly hyperinflation, which would drive the value of their currencies to zero. So I think that preparing alternative currencies, alternative payment systems is certainly being discussed under under Trump administration, and we'll find out in time. But many of these policy moves uh, cannot be, they cannot be discussed overtly because they will open themselves to an attack. I think that I think that they will have to collectively ambush us with this. And so I think we'll find out when it happens. But given how this administration is pretty much turning up everything, including discussing elimination of uh, personal income tax, that we shouldn't be surprised if, let's put it this way, we should expect surprises. I just don't know what they might be.
Yeah, if there's anyone to launch huge surprises on the world, I guess
That
it's
would be
Donald
Trump.
Trump.
Yeah.
It's he has a knack for that. Anyways, before I log off, where can people find you?
Well, I'm active on X. My handle is at Naked Hedgie. I have a daily publication on Substack for investors and traders called iSystem Trend Following. And then I have a personal Substack where I write less frequently a bit, but more a broader, let's say a broader range of subjects, which is called Alex Grainer's Substack. That's the three main platforms where I'm active.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. It's been yeah, excellent to talk to you. I've been looking forward to this, and yeah, definitely, yeah, it's been great. So thank you so much. I hope to be able to
Thank you,
speak with you
Glenn.
again.
It was a pleasure, and I'll look forward to the next time.